Hi, I'm Rob,
And I'm Lily.
and welcome back to Hazel's Flight School. This episode, we're going to be talking about red wine, and specifically, we're going to be exploring body and structure in red wines and why these things are important.
Rob, what do these red wines have in common with each other?
Pretty much the color. It's a little more complicated than that. They do also have some structural components, of course, that they share, that all wines share. And those elements would include acid and other compounds, and more importantly, tannins, which we find a lot of in red wines, but we don't find so much in white wines. And we're going to dive into that a little bit here and see and explore and talk about why that matters and how that makes a difference in how a red wine drinks. So we're starting with what's actually a very rare grape, very difficult to come by, but we've got a great example here. The grape is called Piculit Neri, and it was almost extinct just a couple of decades ago, and they've brought it back from the brink, and we're lucky enough to get to try an example of it today. I know, how cool is that? So again, we're not going to focus too much on aromas and flavors. We're really going to just be talking about and exploring the structure of the wine and how the wine is put together. So what are your first impressions?
Young red fruit, some herbal influences as well,
Nice.
some zest. That one seems to be a theme for me today. Citrus zest.
Could be your palate, could be the wines. Your palate will change through the day. It will change from day to day quite a bit. Some days it's going to be more sensitive, some days less sensitive. We just have to live with that. We're humans. It's my understanding that we are actually best with our noses and our smell early on in the day, and especially before we've eaten anything. Reasonable to assume that's a survival thing that we've evolved. You get up in the morning and you have to go find your food. Probably best that you have a sensitive nose to help you find things, but also tell you what not to eat when you do find it.
So we should start doing fasted early morning tastings.
Absolutely, and I do try to do that a little bit, actually, to not have too much food. And again, food can influence your palate so much. You do sometimes have to be careful with that. When I have staff trainings here at Hazel's, and I'm going to be doing a lot of tasting in the afternoon, when I go to lunch before that, I have to be careful. Certain things I can't eat, because even after, say, a couple of hours, if I've had a lot of mustard on my sandwich, it's gonna mess with my palate. So I've learned to avoid that. Just kind of one of those things. And we're gonna talk a little bit about food and how we pair that, especially with red wines, when we get a little further down the road here. So good point. So I'm gonna ask you a little bit about physically what's your sense of the wine, not about what it smells like or tastes like. What do your taste buds tell you? What does your tongue tell you, your palate?
That this is an airier, lighter wine. Aftertaste, it didn't really linger for me. It wasn't super heavy. My mouth doesn't feel dried out. It's very drinkable.
Excellent. Yeah. So not really drying out your palate too much. I really like that call. This is a lighter red, and you sort of sense that somehow it just doesn't seem to be weighing down your tongue. It doesn't seem to be weighing down your palate so much. And nice and bright. And you use the term young. I would say youthful for the wine. Fresh is a word I would use for this. I love the freshness of the fruit. And to be sure, often that's a sign that they've picked at an appropriate time.
Mm-hmm.
If you pick later, the grapes get heavier, the fruit gets jammier, and it almost feels like that jammy, like the fruit is kind of almost cooked down a little bit. And that can weigh down your palate a little more. And I'm telegraphing something here. We're going to get to that in a minute.
Yeah, and if you picked the grapes earlier, would the wine become even brighter and fresher?
Perhaps. Typically, when you pick earlier, you're going to have higher acidity. So as the grapes get more mature, at a certain point, the acidity will start to fall. And for sure, acidity can give lift and brightness and freshness to a wine, and it's important for that. But it's not exclusively an effect on the wine, if you know what I mean. So yes, picking younger sometimes is a good thing, but you have to be sure that there's enough fruit character in it, and that evolves over time as well. If you pick too soon, you'll get good acidity, you'll have some nice spine, you'll have good lift, but there won't be much depth in the fruit. There just won't really be much going on in the glass. So it's very much a tight wire act for the winemaker, for the viticulturalist to decide when to pick. Can be tricky, and they don't always get it right.
And with this grape, you mentioned that it almost became extinct.
That's right.
Was there a certain family that decided to make an attempt to bring this grape back to life, to make it accessible again?
In fact, it was this very producer, Emilio Bulfon, who saved this wine, we think, from extinction. Found a plot. It was going to be uprooted, we think, and replanted with more productive, more economically viable grapes, if you will. And it's like, wait a minute, we don't want that. Yeah. And brought it back, and it's now coming back. We're starting to take cuttings. They're starting to grow more of this grape and bring back this wonderful old grape that was almost gone and almost lost to us. And you can see it makes a delightful, easy drinking light red. Yeah, we could put a little bit of a chill on that, sit out on the patio and have that.
This is definitely a little bit of a hidden treasure. I hadn't even heard of that grape, so I'm glad we got to try that today.
Very rare. Awesome. Glad you like it. All right. Okay, so now moving to the middle wine. This is coming from the Ribera del Duero, Finca Resalso. We're in Spain now, in one of the highly regarded areas in Spain. Again, Ribera del Duero now, we're talking about the upper reaches of the Duero or the Douro River. The Douro, famous for making port wines. This is the Spanish side of that, and we're in the upper reaches of that river, where they grow a very important red grape, and that red grape is Tempranillo. Easily the most widely planted red grape in Spain. And let's have a crack at it, see what you think. Wow. What do you think? Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Talk about fresh. I'm just getting this beautiful, pure, fresh red cherry, red berry fruits, this lovely raspberry blast, especially on the finish. Absolutely
yeah,
yummy and juicy, delicious. But let's talk about the physical sensations of this wine. There are some really important points that we'd like to make with this wine. So how does it feel?
Yeah, I think in the mouth, definitely softer and lighter than I was expecting based on what I was smelling. And less tannins on the palate, but then very tannic finish, a very tannic aftertaste.
Excellent. I was so hoping to hear that. That's what we were going for this wine. So you're talking about tannins now. And tannins are compounds that we find in all wine grapes, but they're much more prevalent in red grapes. And in fact, we find tannins all over in all sorts of foods. Tannins are the compounds in plants that make things seem bitter or give you that drying effect. For me, the tannins in this wine are sort of making my lip feel a little furry and kind of drying out my lip. And those are tannins that come from the grapes. But you can also get tannins from oak. And those tannins we can often sense a little differently. Sounds like a party trick, but the tannins that come from grapes tend to affect your lips, your gums, maybe a little bit on the front of your tongue. That's where I get it. Tannins that come from oak often affect your tongue a little more. I tend to feel them on the sides of my tongue. They tend to dry out my tongue. And sometimes when a red wine especially has had too much oak, especially used oak, it can almost feel like you're sticking a block of wood on your tongue. And we'll just say this wine is really woody. And I don't mean necessarily this wine has had a lot of oak. What I mean is it's had a lot of oak, but it's not the right kind of oak, and it kind of makes the wine just dries out your tongue. It sucks the moisture out of your tongue. So when you get that drying effect, you'll get that from tannins. There are other effects though with tannins, and it depends on where they come from in the grape and how mature they are. That can sound weird to say, but as red grapes in particular get riper, the tannins also get riper and the tannins get softer. So if we let the grapes that made this wine get really, really, really ripe, they will still have tannins, but those tannins will be much less grippy and much less drying on your palate. And they also can be a little bit bitter. We call those green tannins. We tend to find those in seeds, for example. So what do we do when we have a wine that's too tannic?
We eat steak with it.
We eat steak. That's a good one. Really what we're looking for is fat. And the best example of that is you're making your cup of tea and you're making a nice, strong black tea. And then somebody calls you on the phone and you lose track of time and you come back and that tea bag's been sitting in there for a half an hour. And you go to drink that tea and it's so bitter, it's almost undrinkable. It's strong and good, but so bitter you almost can't drink it. Well, that bitterness are tannins that come from tea. Well, how do you balance that out? How do you fix that?
Fat.
Fat. You don't add water, that just waters down your tea. You add milk or cream, and that fat softens everything on your palate. But cheese is good, animal fats, oils, something to sort of mitigate those tannins on your palate. But there's an exception, and I think you know what it is.
To eating fat with tannins?
Fats and oils with tannins. When do we not go there?
With fish.
With fish, and especially oily fish. There is something that happens with tannins and fishy oils. Now, salmon and tuna are fatty, and you can have a lightly tannic wine with those. Pinot Noir is a classic match for those fish. But when you get into really oily fishes, the tannins that we find in red wines can react very badly, and basically it can seem like you're just chewing on a piece of aluminum foil. It's not fun.
And that's why you don't order red wine at a sushi restaurant.
Are you speaking from experience?
Yes.
Yeah, it might not go well. So that's a big part of why we tend to say whites with fish, reds with other things, no red with fish. It's not impossible, but it can really get you into trouble if you're not careful. So go ahead and explore that, but no, you might cross the line when you're doing it.
I had one question.
Sure.
Why do more red wines have tannins than white wines?
Tannins live, a lot of them, in the skins of the grapes. And so they're related to the color compounds and things like that that are in red grapes. So they're just inherently more of them in a grape to begin with. But also, because we're making a red wine, we're spending a lot of time with that juice resting in the barrel or in the tank or what have you with those skins, and we often want to extract that. So they'll be very aggressive in the winery sometimes. Sometimes they'll do what's called a punch down, and it's just exactly what it sounds like. All the stuff that's fermenting in the tank will float to the surface, and someone will come with this big plunger and they'll punch it down, and that breaks things up and extracts more of those things into the wine. And you can be very aggressive with that, or you can sort of pump it over. You can pull the clean juice off the bottom and sort of sprinkle it over the top, and that will sort of gently also extract those tannins. The tannins also live in the stems and the seeds of the grapes, and the same thing, we can sort of extract those tannins. When a winemaker is doing that, what they're really trying to do is they want those tannins. You're trying to get those tannins. When you take it very, very far down the road, often like they'll do in Bordeaux, a wine that you want to age for a long time, they will extract as many of those tannins as you can, and frankly can make the wines almost undrinkable when they're young. It can just be ferocious. But tannins act as a preservative agent for wine. Acid does as well, and that's very helpful for aging white wines when you want to do that. But with red wines, the tannins give long-term aging potential. They act as a preservative for the wine. So that's why these really famous big Bordeaux and some very famous wines from Spain, Rioja in particular, and some of the more fancy wines from Ribera del Duero can age for so long. They have a lot of tannins in them. And they're not great when they're young, but they're fabulous when they're old, and tannins play a big role there. All right, so third wine now, we're talking about the Fableist. This is a Cabernet Sauvignon coming from what has become a really important area, especially for red grapes in California, and that's Paso Robles. And no offense, Paso, when I was growing up in California as a kid, there wasn't much in the way of a wine scene there. They were really just a pit stop Again, no offense, on the way north or south, up and down the coast of California. But Cabernet Sauvignon in particular, Zinfandel, and some other red grapes have really found a home there. It's become a hugely important part of the red wine scene in California. So considered by some a reference point for California Cabernet. So let's jump right in. All right, first impressions.
It's big, it's jammy, lots of raspberries, cherry, overripe fruit elements.
Look at her go.
I'm saying all the right words.
You exactly are saying all the right words. Keep going. You're doing great.
I'd say some herbal elements is there.
I
And
definitely get that.
maybe like those little poultry bundles of herbs you can buy like at Whole Foods. Like that specific brand. I see some elements of that in here.
Nice. To me, that's in France they would call that garrigue, that sort of herbal element. And it's just a reference to the sort of sense of the herbs that are growing in the area. And that does have that for me as well. And growing up with the California brush, it kind of takes me to that place. Yeah, it very much smells like that. Kind of sage and wild fennel maybe are the kinds of things that are coming out for me. Artemisia, which probably means nothing to most people, but... And that's an important note, by the way. Remember, as always, what you smell, what you taste, the references you have for those things are all you, no right or wrong answers. She's talking about red fruits, cherry and berry fruits and so on. Some of you might not get that, or you might get darker fruits, or you might agree with what she's got to say about this wine. All fair. But I also agree with you, this is a much bigger wine. And what do you mean when you say big? What's your sense of that?
It's fuller, rounder. It feels like it should be taking up almost in a way more space in my mouth, even though it's not, because it's the same volume per sip I take theoretically. But
nice. I like that description. It just seems to fill your mouth more, have more body or weight. And Charlie Masters, our VinMarket rep, gave us a great way to think about body or weight with wine. And the example is milk. So think about the differences between skim milk or non-fat milk, 2% or low-fat milk, and whole milk. And if you've experienced those milks, you get exactly what we talk about with body or weight. That skim milk is going to feel kind of light, maybe thin. In the middle, you're going to get that 2%, that low fat. It's got some texture. You're definitely going to notice it more. And then whole milk, you definitely know you got milk in your mouth. That is a fantastic way of thinking about the spectrum of body in a wine. And we see that here.
this is definitely whole milk.
Definitely whole milk. I'm going to have to agree with you on that. I think, again, here we're also getting some good tannic grip in this wine. Again, with those tannins, that structure in the wine. So those tannins can actually add volume and make the wine feel bigger. How do you feel about the jamminess of this fruit?
I like it. It wasn't overpowering for me, and I still felt like I could taste a lot of different things going on in the wine. It wasn't too strong and too dominant. It was still well balanced.
Nice. Good. All right. Props to Fableist for doing a good job with this. When those wines get jammy, sometimes they get overripe. They can start to get kind of dumbed down and they start to lose their complexity. So we've talked about how wines can expand, grow and develop more depth, develop more complexity as they go, but they can cross a line where it just starts to go the other way. And here, according to you, and I'm inclined to agree, they picked at a good time. So they got really big, ripe fruit, great, bold flavors, but they didn't let it go too far, so the wine stays interesting.
Is this a sweet wine?
I would not characterize this strictly as a sweet wine, but I do get a little sense of sweetness, especially on the finish. So there might be a little bit of what we call residual sugar in there. In this case, it's likely that they didn't really ferment all the sugar that was in there away. So they left a little bit in there. And that's common enough, especially when we have these grapes that seem very, very ripe. So they develop a lot of sugar as they keep getting ripe. And, you know, sometimes you might not want to ferment all that sugar away. The wine might get too big, too much alcohol. Might get to 16, 17%, which is going to be hot. And that's not usually what we look for in wine. So good call on that. Yeah. All right. So great stuff. Great work today. Some of the key takeaways here, especially with the red wines, we really wanted to emphasize for you the importance of body and how tannins in a wine are affected and what we can do about those tannins. So when we talk about a light wine, we're talking about a wine that doesn't really weigh down your palate. When we talk about tannic wines and bigger wines, we're talking about wines that are going to feel a little grippy, a little bitter maybe sometimes. And now we know the key is fat or oil, if you're careful, to sort of mitigate that, play with those tannins, and balance those things out on your palate so it's not so grippy and not so drying. And then we got into a wine with big ripeness and those bold, jammy flavors, and we got to talk about them being jammy. So it seems a little sweet, and it might be a little sweet, but when you can get these big, bold wines with that great depth of flavor, so many people love those wines, and you in particular focused in on this one. The depth and the intensity and the concentration of that fruit that we get when these are ripe. And that's why so many people like these big Paso, California style reds. So what we've actually seen here is that these wines are not like each other. Other than the color, they do have some distinct differences. More tannic, less tannic, jammier, lighter, heavier. Red wines cover an enormous spectrum. And we've got 3 good examples here for you to explore as well. And that's going to do it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Big shout out to Charlie Masters and VinMarket, the distributor, for providing us with these wines and their expertise. And we'll see you again.
Thanks for flying with us today. Subscribe to Hazel's Beverage World on YouTube and put your questions in the comments.